Then we'll have the final presentation. Srinivasan Santhakumar, associated to the University of Groningen. Srini.
Hello?
Yeah, hello, I can hear you. I cannot yet see you. I can see your screen now.
You see the presentation? Yeah.
Welcome. You were telling us about the technological learnings of offshore renewable energy technologies and recommendations for scaling up, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Can I give the floor to you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Srinivasan. I'm one of the ESRs hosted at University of Groningen. Today, I will talk about the technological learning of offshore renewable energy technologies and recommendations for scaling up. So in my agenda, I have two components to talk about today. First, I will introduce my PhD, what are the objectives and methods, and I will sort of give like 4 recommendations or key conclusions from my research. It's not an exhaustive list, but considering the time period of the presentations, I like to convey some important points I have analyzed in my PhD.
Sorry to interrupt, but we don't have any visual of you. Could you perhaps turn your camera on?
Yeah, just.
Thank you.
Could you see me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So first, my objective of the PhD is to investigate how key offshore renewable energy technologies might improve in terms of improvements, scale-up, and implementations. And the technologies I have shortlisted are kind of focused on includes offshore wind, fixed bottom and floating, wave and tidal stream technology, and also biofuel production from the seaweed. In terms of methods, since my objective is to consider technological learning, I didn't kind of narrow down into a single methodology. I sort of looked around different methodologies. One is learning curve. It's not a law, but it's an empirical observation which says the unit cost of a technology or product decrease at a constant percentage for every doubling of its cumulative output. Then the second methodology I've used is the bottom-up engineering cost modeling, where you can model a technology cost in terms of different cost subcomponents, and you can narrow down the cost centers which is affecting the most. The third one is I also try to review the theoretical frameworks available in the literature, for example, innovation theory, growth models to understand the theoretical basis for the technological learning. So I kind of used a mixed method approach to understand the technological learning of the offshore renewable technologies. So I will go ahead with the recommendations or conclusions from my research. First one is to kind of emphasize that technological learning happens in sequential stages. For example, if there's a new innovation coming to the market, it starts with a prototype or demonstration, where there will be like a lot of different designs experimenting in the market. And then in the next phase, some sort of mainstream design convergence will happen and small scale demonstrations will go through that. The next one is the large scale commercial operations of the technology, which could be upscaling phase, and then the next one is the growth phase. In the growth phase, it will be purely not only it will be a mainstream technology in the core market, but it will also start diffusing into the secondary and tertiary markets. Looking at this theoretical framework, when you are trying to analyze the technological learning, the data availability also varies across each stage. For example, in the prototype demonstration, you have to rely purely on the analogous technology cost informations, but going period by period, you will also get some price data, but it's also, we will have to understand there will be some market dynamics because at the prototype, there will be few companies, and then there will be new market entrants, and there will be some sort of market shakeout phase, and then there will be a market consolidation. So going through this life cycle, we also have to understand how the profit margin happens between these stages. So this was kind of a theoretical framework we developed, and we tried to fix the offshore technologies at each stage, considering the development. So we try to fix the offshore wind at the upscaling phase, and also the wave and tidal and the biofuel production from the seaweed at the prototype and demonstration phase. So the next one is we apply this framework to understand what's happening with the fixed bottom offshore wind until 2020. So we try to use 2 parameters. One is the cumulative capacity, which is a proxy for the market growth in the European markets. And the next one is the turbine rated power, how it has been developing over years. So it's proxy to understand the units upscaling. When I mean unit upscaling, it's part of the economies of scale, but it's not exactly like a manufacturing scale of economies. So unit scale economies in the sense, I mean, if you increase the capacity of the unit size, for example, generation capacity of the wind turbine, you will reduce the fixed cost of the particular unit. But if you take a modular technology and start manufacturing in large numbers, you will reduce the overhead in the manufacturing unit, and we call those things as the manufacturing scale of economy. So there is two types of economies of scale, and that's what I was trying to differentiate with the offshore wind turbine. So if you're going through the formative phase of offshore wind, it has been faster because it's more or less around 10 years. It is much lesser compared to the other technologies, what we have seen in the, for example, coal or combined cycle power plants, which has taken several decades with the formative phase. The faster formative phase is due to the fact that it is based on the onshore wind and also oil and gas industry practices. Then they were actually deploying onshore wind turbines in the formative phase. Then they were running out of problems. So during the upscaling phase, they started developing wind turbines specifically for offshore conditions with higher rated capacity. For example, I'm sure you have seen pictures of comparing offshore wind turbines to tallest buildings in the world and similar sort of that. And there is a growth phase. Once the technology has proven its viability in the market, there will be market pull mechanisms to increase the capacity in the energy system, and also it start to diffuse into the secondary market. A good example is offshore wind is moving from European markets to the Asia Pacific region nowadays. And in the formative phase, the offshore wind has taken a lot of practices from the onshore wind and oil and gas industry, but also there is a very spillover effect from going from offshore wind to onshore wind. It includes the recent developments of introducing newer platforms, deploying offshore wind technologies in the onshore wind turbines to increase its capacity factor. So this is the case study where we try to separate the developments in different phases so that we could understand what are the cost developments and what are the learning mechanisms happening in each stage. So, and our second point is to emphasize the financing cost. Financing costs play a significant role in the development of large-scale energy technologies. So, the picture shows a LCOE estimation for a wind farm, fixed bottom offshore wind farm, which could come online in 2022 or 2023, which has a capacity of 1 gigawatt. And I try to show the technology costs and the financing expenditure at different discount rates. So when I say financing expenditure, it is driven by three factors. One is cost of capital or discount rate, and the technology costs which need to be financed. And the third one, the capacity factor, which discounts all the technology costs in the lifetime revenue. So we will only focus on the cost of capital for now, keeping all the other things constant. As you can see, going from 4% to 10%, the LCOE increases by 59%. So when you look at the cost of capital, it's driven by base interest rates in the economy, which is related to the macroeconomic factors. And there is also the premiums expected for debt and also equity. So when the technology is new, there will be a lot of investment risks, but as the experience effect happens, the development risk will also decline. And also once the investors become very certain about their revenues, both the premiums expected by the investors will decrease. Those are the major factors for the cost of capital. We also try to understand what's happening in the fixed bottom offshore wind. So we try to model that cost of capital for different countries in the European region. Our major observations were after economic crisis in 2008, the base interest rates have decreased drastically. And also there has been targeted incentives, for example, CFD contracts or SD plus in Netherlands. And also there is a lot of market competition introduced by the auction mechanisms, and also increased confidence in the technology has decreased the debt premiums and expected return on investments. If you can see I don't know if you can see the cursor, but in the top right, if you see the UK from 2000 to 2010, the policy mechanism they were using is ROC, which it's called Renewable Obligation Certificate, where they have like a uncertain revenue model, comparing to the Belgium, where there's the green certificates, or in Netherlands, it's some sort of fixed feed-in tariff. So after that, they have changed that ROC to the CFD contracts, which provide much better certainty on the revenues for the investors. So it becomes more competitive in the later periods. That was the second point. For the third one, so when I mentioned the financing expenditure is based on 3 factors. One is the cost of capital, which is discount rate, and there is also the third option, which I mentioned about the annual energy production or capacity factor. So I would like to mention understanding the nature of the energy source and also the technology characteristics beforehand can be beneficial in designing effective market policies. So the figure on the right shows the development of the capacity factor for offshore wind farms deployed in the European markets. So it has increased from 30% to almost 50% in 2020. So it's not purely because of the site with better wind resources, but it's also because of the technology development. So we are seeing like 10 plus megawatt turbines with the really tall uprights and also larger rotors, which increases the capture efficiency. So adding to the capacity factor, adding to the cost of capital, capacity factor also plays a great role in reducing the levelized cost of electricity. So we also looked at the cost outlook, what could happen for the fixed bottom and the floating wind. In both areas, the capacity factor has played a greater role in cost reductions, adding to the technology cost in the floating wind. Also, you can see the financing expenditure effect from floating wind, where when the technology is new, there will be a lot of investment risk. So all the investors will be expecting a higher return, but after having experience effect, the returns will also decrease, similar to what we have seen in the fixed bottom offshore wind. So, but this is the nature of the wind energy source, but it's not same for all the energy technologies. So you can't scale up the devices for all the technologies, for example, solar PV. So we also need to understand the characteristics of the technology and also the nature of the resource. The next point is like broadly, we can classify the characteristics in 2 ways. So the technologies which can have the unit scale economies and technologies which cannot have unit scale economies, or simply you can call them as modular technologies. So for the technologies with unit scale economies, a good example is offshore wind and also onshore wind, for example, combined cycle gas turbines. So its development sequences, first they will be experimenting, and there will be unit upscaling, and then after it becomes saturated, there will be purely learning by doing, and then it goes into maturation. So in this way, there will be like a lot of R&D happening within the institutions or majorly only in the industry. So even though the learning rates for the investment cost can be low, but the performance improvements and also the cost reduction in other components will result in higher SUV reduction. On contrary, if you take the modular technologies, since it is not capital intensive, there will be faster standardization of the technological design, and the learning by doing, or else you can call it as a manufacturing scale of economies, will already kick in faster. So they are historically, you can see learning rates more than 15% in the investment cost, but the performance improvements and the cost reduction can be limited. So I will try to explain the nature of energy resource understanding using the example of wave and tidal energy system. So the figure shows the number of both of the technologies are in the prototype and demonstration phase, which doesn't have a clear large-scale commercial project yet. But for the tidal energy system, almost most of the developers have converged to a design similar to wind turbine. However, we can't scale up the turbines similar to wind turbines because there will be like a water depth limitation. So you have to give clearance for shipping lanes or these kind of things, which will introduce a cap on the performance itself. On contrary, for the wavelengths, the wavelength, most common design is the point observer, and which when the wavelength of the wave is smaller, it limits the developing large-scale devices. So you will only see devices less than 1 megawatt or 2 megawatts. So these devices are expected to be modular, on contrary to the wind turbines what we are seeing now. So one thing is to understand is not only to understand the nature of the energy resource, but we also need to understand the characteristics of technology, so we can strike a balance between R&D funding and market pull incentives. So these examples are to emphasize the market pull incentives is not always the answer. My last point is to understand, to show for the offshore wind system, grid connection costs also play a significant role in planning of the future offshore energy systems. So the figure shows the levelized cost of transmission matrix for a 700 megawatt offshore HVAC radial connection. So there are three influencing factors. One is the distance to shore, utilization factor, or the capacity factor of the wind farm, and also the skill of the transmission. So for example, if you're deploying a substation at offshore, you need to lay the cables, and there will be like a lot of fixed costs. So the economics of the scale will also play a greater role, and that is the relation shown in the second figure. I only model until 100 kilometers because after 100 kilometers, HVDC is expected to be competitive. So you can still use the HVAC, but it will be more expensive than the HVDC because we need to compensate for the reactive power losses. So in the previous presentation, a lot of people have raised concerns about the offshore spatial constraint, cable routing, and also we need to manage the high share of renewables onshore. So the transportation is not always going to be electricity. Maybe we can convert it to the hydrogen or some other liquid fuels, and also the interconnected capacity expansion between countries in the North Sea. So these requirements call for an integrated offshore grid, and which requires a system level planning, which is currently absent. So those are the 4 key points I'd like to mention. Thank you for your attention.